This is Family Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Rick Skwiot. We're going to talk about the Bootlegger's Bride, and you're an author, and it's the first time you've been on the show. So, welcome to the Family Electric Ghost podcast. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine, and thanks for having me on.
So, like a couple of questions before we get to the heart of your story, I always ask every guest is what motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
I do it because I've always wanted to, I guess, ever since I was a child. I always liked writing. And writing fiction and novels particularly is the one thing I found in life that really uses up everything inside me, everything that's ever happened to me, everything I've experienced, every a friendship, association, everything I've read and saw. It's all material that I draw on. So it's pleasurable work for me.
Do you find as a creative, as a writer, that you find yourself being able to process or see what happens around you in the world and then use that as input into your artistic work, which is your writing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything's fair game. And so, including stuff I read and everything else I see. And I, like many writers, I tend to be a listener and not a talker, so I can learn stuff from other people. And I listen to their stories very carefully because you never know when it's going to be a germ for a short story or a novel. Just one simple sentence sometime or one experience is something that can be used. So one should always be careful when interviewing writers who are talking to writers. You don't give up those secrets that you don't want broadcast to the world, you know.
Yeah, because it's like, I always looked at the Victorians talking about like the muse, and a lot of people talk about in terms of downloads, like the universe gave me something and I kind of downloaded it, and I can channel, like especially singer-songwriters.
Yeah.
They talk about channeling like the inner self and the
Yeah.
outer world, because they can pick up like what's in like a microcosm and a macrocosm and then synthesize it into something new.
Yeah. And the other thing about it is you never know where it's going to come from. It comes from the unlikeliest places, and somehow sometimes it seems sort of magical that when you need something, it'll somehow pop up somewhere. It's, I guess, what the psychologist Jung called synchronicity, is that things sort of work when you need them to work, and that's a thrill when that happens. You have one of those eureka moments. That's what I needed.
It's like a law of attraction, like the frequencies like come to you, or you're able to synthesize them, and you find a way to bring in like the discordance and the harmony and the noise and kind of synthesize it into something that's like a whole. But it can represent all those things.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what it's like in music, but this is a real sloppy job to try to put together a novel, because it's just, you don't know where it's going when you start, and it takes new turns all the time. It becomes something different, and the characters change and the story changes. And yeah, so
you're like, so I know, like I deal with some fantasy writers, and they spend a lot of time building these world building. They spend a lot of time building the structure of that world, the character design to that world, kind of storyboarding it out, and create this like unique universe. But if you're more of a kind of flow state or in the moment, like you could have a plan, but like a jazz musician, a fusion jazz musician, if somebody plays a different note, I might evolve to that note, or actually, that day, what I feel that day at the gig gets reflected in the piece at that time. So you might be more, maybe it's not sequential all the time. It's like it can happen in different.
Certainly not. Yeah, never sequential. And the one difference, so from these fantasy writers that are creating the world, I would deal with the world that's already been created, and all my books are set in places that I'm intimately familiar with. And this particular one, The Bootlegger's Bride, is set in St. Louis, Missouri, where I originally was born and raised and spent a number of years. And so that setting suggests to me certain characters or aspect of characters. So the setting sort of determines character, and then the characters determine the plot as they start acting and speaking.
Because you took a big timeline that went from like the Great Depression, Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam War. So is that because the protagonist you're following that, or what's that timeline involve?
Well, it involves the life of a young bootlegger, a young man in St. Louis who's been kicked out of his home in North St. Louis. He comes from an immigrant Polish family, and his father's thrown him out of the house because he doesn't like his participation in the bootleg, and so he's trying to make a life for himself. So that's how this family, the Nowak family, is generated from him, from his father down to him. He's a bootlegger. He ends up being a successful bootlegger thanks to being also a somewhat ruthless bootlegger at time. And he moves into loan sharking and that during Prohibition because booze was available, money wasn't. So he started selling money instead of booze. And he meets a beautiful school teacher at the racetrack of all places. And they fall in love and have a child. And their son, AJ, becomes really the focus of the book. His father, the bootlegger, is killed in the Normandy invasion in World War II. And then his mother's death, Hazel, the school teacher, follows some time after that because of her despondency, and she's being blackmailed by one of his gangland associates. Mm-hmm. And she wants to preserve her son's legacy, and so she seemingly commits suicide. And so the story is about this orphan, AJ, and how he comes of age, and how as he discovers these dark family secrets that he tries to save himself from his anger and try to build a life for himself. And in the end, he has to make a pivotal decision as whether or not to avenge his mother's death.
That's really interesting because a lot of times you talk about bootleggers, people think about Capone and Chicago, but you're doing it in a totally different, well, not a different city, but the same kind of idea. Is there some aspects of St. Louis that you wanted to kind of separate from that kind of Chicago kind of known property that a lot of people talk about or write about?
Yeah, well, I was compelled to write this book because of the stories I heard from my parents and grandparents growing up.
So it's like real life was triggering it rather than totally fantasy.
Right. And my family, different members of my family were involved in the bootlegging process, although they weren't kingpins or anything. For example, my Polish grandfather stored barrels of whiskey around their tenement flat in this old North St. Louis pre-Civil War building. And he had barrels of whiskey. It was like furniture in the living room, from what I understand. People would sit on the barrels instead of sofas and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But his wife was also a Polish immigrant and afraid of being arrested and deported, started sleeping on the sofa until her husband got rid of the whiskey. And his son, my father, saw his neighbor gang gunned down as he was sitting talking to him on the stoop of their flat. Car came around a corner and guy got out, plugged him in the head, and drove off. And this is replicated in the novel, this scene of this killing. And also on my mother's side of the family, that's the surprisingly the German side was not they were on the consuming end of the of Prohibition. They weren't involved in it. And but she did label some bottles for downstairs neighbors who were making bathtub gin. But her father somehow managed to drink himself to death during when liquor was prohibited. So it's sort of a notable achievement.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
But it's a coming of age story that's kind of pinned in a true stories from your family, but it's historical fiction. You've kind of taken some liberties with that story and expanded on it.
Yes, and a lot of research that went into this because I obviously wasn't alive then, and I knew the neighborhood, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. Really, I was there recently, and a lot of the buildings are gone. It's sort of an urban prairie these days, and few of the landmarks still stand. But I had to do a lot of research to put everything in the right place at the right time. I used newspaper archives and a lot of other stuff that I could access online to make sure that the weather's right, the newspaper headlines are right, the cars are right, the fashions are right, the costs of things are right.
So how much like prep work and going to the library, going through all the newspaper articles, were you looking for photographs and descriptions of that era, or were you kind of, using that as more like historically correct information? Is that where you're pulling from those sources?
Well, I'm pulling from the sources to make sure I get everything right, but also it stimulates things because I learn things as I'm writing that that can help with this plot movement.
Mm-hmm.
If I do this, and I don't go to libraries anymore. I do everything online because
Everything's
it's
online. You can get to everything. You don't have to go through the Dewey Decimal System to pick
oh
everything up.
yeah, the card catalog I used to hate. When I was a kid. And going through all that and the stacks of libraries and then the microfiche and the other.
Yeah, I was wondering, were you going through the microfiche? Were you going
No.
looking at the newspapers like that, or you're actually going through it online?
Yeah, I'm going through them online. I use the St. Louis Daily, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was the last remaining daily there. I subscribed to their archive, and they have everything for the.
Oh, everything's digitized. I wasn't aware of how much is actually digitized today. Because no
Yeah,
child is.
there's a lot. There's a website, I think it's newspapers.com or something like that, where you can get into the archives of virtually every American newspaper and foreign newspapers as well. So that's all there. And then if you're writing a contemporary novel, you've got Google Earth and other things. You can see what neighborhoods and streets and buildings and everything actually look like, no matter where you are in the world.
Yeah, when you write in historical fiction, you got to get like the accurate description of the cars from each era. What the rooming houses or the apartments or the houses. If you want to describe it in detail as a writer, people build that scene. When you read, you get this kind of, it's like a cinematic view when you get into a really good novel of and what you choose to focus on or what you want the reader to like pick out of that. So like when you're coming up with the details of the story, you're trying to get the feel kind of almost like cinematic vision of like somebody gets pulled into that story and they're like, wow, I'm actually in Prohibition era, St. Louis.
Yeah, well, I was fortunate in that. Unfortunately, being old enough, I saw a lot of this area of St. Louis while it was still functioning and still peopled. And so I knew what it looked like and what the streets looked like. I remember at my grandmother's flat, and this wasn't all that long ago, but it's long enough ago that I remember that even in those days, when I was a child, they still have an outhouse on the alley. It's one of those cold water flats. And so I still have all those memories and very vivid for me. And I spent a lot of time running around on those streets when I was a kid.
So you recalled a lot of the detail
right
from memory, and then you backed it up with the newspaper research.
Right. And another of the primary settings in this book is when after Jan Nowak, the bootlegger, makes his killing, so to speak, in the bootlegging business, and marries the school teacher, he buys a place on this lake outside of Granite City, Illinois, which is across the river where the steel mills are and stuff. But there's a bucolic lake there. And it was a lake where my parents took me when I was a year and a half old, and we lived there for 7 or 8 years. So I'm very familiar with that and with the Indian mounds around there, the Indian burial mounds, and
so you're bringing all these kind of childhood memories into the story to give it like the actual accuracy.
Right. So I do that, and then a lot of it too is reading various historical sources, and a lot of it's just imagination as well. But I try to make sure that what is knowable to me, I get right.
Mm-hmm. So when you're moving over this time pattern, it goes like all the way from Prohibition to Vietnam War.
Right.
Are there particular with your protagonist, like the history of the bootleg era impacts him in what ways?
Well, it impacts the whole family significantly because he was very successful at it.
Mm-hmm.
So even though he dies relatively young, he's 30 years old, I think, when he dies in the war. But he leaves a legacy for his wife, a financial legacy, as well as a legacy of some criminal activity. But he leaves that legacy for his son, which is important because that allows him some freedom as he struggles with being an orphan and trying to make his way in the world. Um, and it's important too, I think, because when I started doing research on this book, and when the protagonist becomes an orphan, and I started researching orphans myself, and found out this interesting thing, that there's so many really notable orphans in literature and history, beginning with Moses to Huck Finn and people in between, like Aristotle and Eleanor Roosevelt and Madame Curie. They're all orphans. So I started reading up about them, and they share certain qualities. Because they're orphans, they are self-sufficient. They have to rely on their own wiles. A lot of them are very clever because they have to arrange things and manipulate things. And they're on their own, so they have to have some ambition and some drive to get on in the world. And you see this in the fictional side too, with orphans like Tom Jones and Jane Eyre and Tarzan and Superman. All orphans, but important orphans in history.
They're able to kind of be self-made or have a directional focus
Yeah,
that makes them get something done. I mean, they actually have impact, they have a vision for what they want to do.
and quite often they don't have as much as our families support us and provide for us and succor us. They also inhibit us in many cases.
Oh,
So
yeah.
without the obligations to family, one is free to.
You're not in the box.
Yeah, yeah, right.
You can have that out of the box thinking. If you have no existing like, oh, you need to go work at the mill, you need to be a lawyer, you
Yeah,
need to be this. Like if you don't know what you should be, then the possibility is like, well, I could be whatever I want to be.
exactly. Yeah. So that there's a certain amount of freedom in that most of us who were lucky enough not to be orphans don't have.
Yeah, that actually is an advantage. Like sometimes you're disadvantaged. Like a lot of times in music, we like to use limitations. Right. So like a certain instrument might have some limitations that allows us to use it in ways that we can actually kind of break some rules. Like,
Right.
so sometimes we can use those boundaries to kind of go push beyond it. And so sometimes like you're given like some core kind of like, I don't know, putty in your hands, and people say, well, you can only do this, but you might be able to actually expand it to do something what you didn't. You're
Yeah.
thinking out the box is like, well, I didn't know I couldn't do that. Like
Yeah.
Orson Welles was known for like when they said, well, how did you do these film angles? How do you do these slides? I didn't know what you couldn't do.
Yeah.
If you
But
don't know what you can't do, then you can do anything.
but your point about the limitations is good, because we all, particularly creative people, we all need limitations. We need frames to push against, even if it's just a frame around a painting or whatever. And it's the same way in my line of trying to do creative writing. You have a certain covenant with the reader that there are things you can and cannot do. There's expectations that you have with this invisible reader about how the book may end or where it can go, and the logic of it and the veracity of the characters. And they all have to be human in a way. Even if they're animals or some fantastical thing, they still have to have human motivations and recognizable human wants uh, and actions that otherwise no one will buy into it. So it's good to have those sorts of boundaries that you can push against, and sometimes go in new directions to do something that's really significantly an improvement on the genre.
So I wanted to bring up the theme of like the anti-war theme, because you have World War II, and not a lot of people were like anti-World War II because we were like bombed at Pearl Harbor, and everybody was kind of buying in, like we need to do this.
Yeah,
But when we get to Vietnam, then people are like, well, we're not sure if we need to do this.
right. And even in World War II and all wars, that in those days, every man had to make a decision. Every young man had to make a decision. And as World War II progressed, some of the older guys, like Jan Nowak, who had a wife and child, ended up being drafted. And if he had still been a single guy and being a bootlegger, he could have fixed it to dodge it, to buy somebody off or buy a doctor off or do something. But here he had a wife and a child, and he couldn't tar them with that, because if he's a draft dodger, it reflects on his family forever. So everyone has to make those kind of decisions, and particularly when you're in the Midwest and the war in Europe seems so far away. And what does it have to do with me that the Japs are going to come and bomb us? The Nazis aren't going to roll Panzers down my road by the lake. So it's a difficult decision for a lot of people, and it's agonizing, particularly when you have others who are dependent on you, as Jan did, as the protagonist did. He had a wife and child that he had to be worried about too. So it's not just about me, it's about people around me.
That's interesting, because a lot of people, I guess, might assume because of the Greatest Generation, they would always talk about the World War II. They on Omaha Beach, everybody was like 100%. Yeah, but they had to understand before, we get into the world, there a lot of people were isolationists. They were more like they didn't see a reason to go into the war until Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And even then, people maybe weren't, and maybe it's interesting the dynamic you're talking about, because I don't know a lot about that other than what I've read about the history. But from your perspective, having an individual character is like, maybe I'm not so gung-ho about doing this, but you have to do it.
Yeah, that was part of the reality. And I lived through the Vietnam era and was, faced with that. Unfortunately, I had a medical condition that kept me out of it. I was drafted, but didn't pass the physical. So I didn't go. And who knows? It might have been something that really had made me and helped me, or it might have killed me. You never know what's going to happen. So
you don't.
I'm glad not to have been cannon fodder. Let's put it that way.
Oh yeah, because a lot of people we're getting drafted, just put to the front line, and then you're just cannon fodder. Like you're making strategic decisions. You're just getting sent to the front. So it's interesting, the anti-war undertones that you talked about, maybe how it resonates with the modern audiences, because it seems like a lot of people today are kind of burned out, with the exploits of going to all these foreign wars. A lot of people, at least in America, are like, we don't. There's a mindset now that's like, why are we doing that?
Yeah, well, since World War II, the United States, for better or worse, has been the great global power, and so people depend on us from all over the world. So, and they look to the United States when there are issues they want resolved, whether it's in Europe or Asia or Africa or even Latin America. So we got a big footprint, and so there's always that discussion. The Middle East too, where we've we're still trying to resolve that after years of conflict and lives lost, both from Americans and others too. So it's going to be an ongoing question, because we are not going to end up being anything other than a great world power anytime soon.
Well, these ideas of balance of power, like Kissinger and Nixon, they have these balance of power concepts of how you balance against, the Red Menace.
Yeah, right.
But that doesn't seem to be the primary thing anymore. But it's interesting. How is that dynamic in the book? In your storyline, how does that kind of evolve, or maybe you can elaborate on it a little bit?
Yeah, it evolves because it helps define the characters and helps define their lives. And Jan's brother-in-law, who works at the steel mill there in Granite City, making tanks and whatnot, and turrets for tanks and other machinery like that, has a drafter firm because he's in a necessary industry. Mm. But it helps define the characters, and it helps to shape their home life and their community life. And it leads to a very dramatic and heartbreaking end to this great love match. This is a great love story in here between Jan and Hazel Robinson. So it ends that rather tragically as well. So it's important to the plot. It's important to all the characters and their development. And it is just a reflection of what was going on in those times.
And just bringing up the title, because the title of the book is The Bootlegger's Bride. And then we were talking about the protagonist and like why choose The Bootlegger's Bride as the title of the book, just from a understanding like how that links.
Well, I guess it could have been called the Bootlegger's Son, perhaps more accurately, because it's more like AJ's book. A lot of it has to do with his coming. It's a coming of age story and a love story and a murder mystery all rolled into one. But perhaps after the 150th draft of the book, or how many it was I went through on this, I had a number of titles, and titles are always tough for me. I'm not a good person to write titles for my work. But I had a title. I even sold it on the title it was going to be published on. And then all of a sudden, it occurred to me as I was, again, proofreading the book for I don't know how many times I've done that. But it occurred to me that Hazel, AJ's mother, Jan's wife, was the catalyst for everything that happens in this book.
Oh,
that makes the bootlegger falls in love with her and goes straight. Okay. The marriage to him also changes her profoundly and leads to her demise, and it also leads to their sons becoming an orphan. So everything sort of hinges around her. She's like at the core of this vortex of this family and the way it develops.
She's like the whole spark that kicks the whole thing and like off. If you have this like pivotal character that actually is the root cause, the root connector. So like, okay, this is how everything kind of dynamically flows from this person and these points that these things that happened kind of predetermined this directional.
Well, yeah, focus. It's not her story, but there wouldn't be a story without her.
Yeah, it's kind of like that's the pivotal person. You're in ancestral history that kind of triggers like the direction that the family goes or the direction that the protagonist in the family goes for that particular person. Right. That's their kind of motivating forces that kind of guide them in a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So, in terms of constructing this book in this age of people's attention spans being limited, I kind of grew up, with there's 200,000 word count books, 300,000 word count books, and now today people are saying like, oh, you can only have 70,000 word count books. Does that play a factor that people's attention span in this market, or did you write the book based on what it needs to be, regardless of what the word count kind of issues are today?
Yeah, the books, all my books are compressed. I try to write very concisely and to not have any flowery language in it, and not to have any adjectives or adverbs. I want to have sharp dialogue. I want to have crisp descriptions and good images in the book. And all my books turn out to be like 60,000, 65,000 words, 70,000. They're all in that range. And one of the reasons, perhaps, are just the people who were my mentors and people who I read that influenced my writing so much. One, when I was a young man, was Hemingway, because I loved his short stories and I loved how concise he was. And then as I started broadening my reading, I became enamored with the French novelist Georges Simenon, who's probably most known for his psychological novels, which in Europe are called Simenons. They call this short psychological novels Simenons, and also for the Inspector Maigret stories in Paris. But he always cut everything as bare as it could be. There are no transitions or anything in his novels, but it's also raw, all the emotion of it and the words and the dialogue. And he described himself as a pointillist writer. And if you know art, you know that pointillism was the thing like Seurat and some of these French impressionists, post-impressionists, who just did little dots on the canvas. And you couldn't see what they were, and you'd stand back and it all came together. And that's the way his novels were. And I was always intrigued by how spare, how lean, and how captivating his novels were, because there wasn't enough, there wasn't too much upholstery in them.
That's kind of this idea of music that sometimes you go with something that's more bare bones. Like if you go with something that sounds closer to a demo, doesn't have a lot of overdubs, there's a lot of space between the notes.
Yeah.
Like you think about like a Bruce Springsteen, like Nebraska. It's kind of like a demo, very short, concise album, not overdubbed like Born to Run. Took like 6 months to do. It's tons of Phil Spector, tons, everything's that's thrown at it, like the kitchen sink thrown at it, versus something that's like a leaner, more direct, emotional thing. That does more like William Blake, compared to like Wordsworth or Tennyson.
Which is why I like blues so much, and was raised on rhythm and blues in St. Louis. It's clean and it's spontaneous, and it comes from the heart. So yeah, that's the kind of work I like, whether it's music or writing.
Yeah, not like a progressive rock band, like a Yes.
No,
not that Yes is bad, but like if you're trying to get to the Mississippi Delta blues or Chicago blues, is like, well, it's not the same thing.
Yeah, I had friends in college who thought that Yes, they're musician friends, and they thought the Yes was really great. I was thinking, I don't get it, it's over my head. Yeah,
well, it's kind of like this idea, purist idea, like you get like the Stones.
Yeah.
Right. Like Keith Richards, they were having an argument between like Keith Richards and Jimmy Page. And Jimmy Page is saying, well, Keith is too ramshackle. He's not like a pure musician. He can't write really delicate, complicated things. He's kind of guttural blues. Well, what's wrong with that? Like Exile on Main Street is great. Like why not?
Well, to diverge just a little bit into music for a second, but growing up in St. Louis, I heard some great music when I was a youngster and a young man. And on Tuesday nights, I would go to the Club Imperial and see Ike and Tina Turner and their band. I think it cost $1 to get in, and they were live on stage, and it was lovely to see that kind of talent. There was just other people who were almost as good and just didn't get the breaks who were around all these clubs there. So it was a great place to hear music back in the day.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you've kind of, focused in with the length of your books and kind of being direct to the heart and not having extraneous, unnecessary, input or content, which, today people like, if you're more direct, you got to get that hook. Like as a musician, if you don't get somebody in the first couple, 3, 4, 5 seconds, they don't stay in the song.
Yeah.
So with a book, it's like if you don't speak to them or get them hooked, they won't stay in the book.
Well, and what I want them to do is to get into the actual soul of the book, to the emotion of the book, and I don't want them focusing on sentences or the language or the words. I want them to go into where the action is taking place, to pick up the emotion, to be there. So I put in the necessary sensory details, so I know they know what it feels like there, if the birds are singing, what the weather is, what it looks like generally, but just enough to put them in the scene so they're focused on what's happening. It's like listening to the radio instead of watching a movie, because when you listen to a radio drama, you have to use your imagination, you have to picture it. And so it's that way with reading too. And it's a luxury that you can't enjoy when you're watching a movie, because it's going along lickety-split frame by frame.
Yeah,
but when you're reading a book, it's dictating. But when you're reading a book, and particularly sorts of books that I like to write, that are really, you get to stay with these people and feel with what they're feeling, and use and bring aspects of yourself into the work, and feel for the people and become acquaintances, and you're rooting for them or against them or whatever.
Have you ever been like really amazed by a reader's understanding of a book, like the way they saw it versus what you wrote? Because as a musician, sometimes what happens, they put the song in the world, and the listener suddenly owns it. Like their interpretation becomes like, well, that's how they view it.
Yeah.
Like I could have wrote it with this intention, but when they listen to it, they get this different picture in their head or in their mind. Um, have readers commented back to you with stuff, and you were like, "Oh, I didn't see it that way."
The only time I experience that is when I get a bad review, and it's like, what's this? But most of the feedback I get is positive feedback. Is from people who enjoy the book and want to reach out and tell me something about it, and reviewers, and the reviews I get on Goodreads or Amazon that are always very much, in rare cases, except in rare cases, they're very positive. So that's good. So that tells me that I'm doing something right, that I'm having people enjoy what I'm doing and take something from it. And quite often they take stuff out of it that I didn't realize was there, because we each bring our own experiences to literature.
Has that, like, I guess I was trying to get at, has that surprised you what they got out of it? Not that they gave you a bad review, but they got something out of it that you didn't expect. Have you ever been really surprised? And they weren't saying they loved the book, but they interpreted something very wildly differently than what you maybe intended.
Yeah, that happens on occasion, and it's instructive, because it's like, well, this is deeper and more complex than I thought it was, But generally, it's, if they're getting something from it, I think they're not sharing the real deep stuff sometimes, because sometimes it suggests something in their lives that they connect with, but don't talk about.
Yeah. It's so personal they didn't actually reveal it back to you. That's fine. I was just wondering if anybody kind of gave you that picture, because it can be informative. Like a lot of times with music, people interpret things wildly differently than what the writer intended, and then we're like, "Oh, I didn't see that they saw it that way," but that's fine.
The only time I experience that is when people see some of the characters differently than I do. Like I tend to fall in love with all my characters, even the villains, in some ways, because they're my babies. I created all of them, and sometimes people surprise me because they don't. They have different takes on the characters. They dislike people who I find not negative people, but people who have more complex issues than most of us have to deal with. So they have to make tougher choices. So sometimes I'm surprised that people view characters in a negative way, where I don't feel negatively about them.
Is it harder to create like a villain type character for you, or is it easier for you to create that character than like the protagonist, so-called good guy kind of protagonist, versus like an anti-hero or a villain that's really kind of like the star of the book? I'm just trying to get a read on that.
Well, I think it's probably, to be perfectly frank about this, I think it's probably easier for me to write characters that I really embrace. So I think good people is what I prefer to write about. But all literature has to deal with problems. You don't have a story unless someone's got a problem they're facing. And when I do write my villains and the negative people, I write them like I write my protagonists, is that they're human and they have good traits and bad traits as well. And we're all complex, very complex creatures. And given the situation, sometimes we have moral quandaries and other things we have to deal with and struggle with. So, yeah, I leave that to the reader to make up their minds about my characters. And I purposely try not to be didactic and to say that this person's bad and this is the villain and this is.
People make their own choice.
Yeah, we all have angelic moments and devilish moments, and it's the way we are as humans.
So we have like multi-dimensional characters where it's not clear cut. Like everybody could have a problem, and in certain situations that you could you might be like the anti-hero or maybe like a negative behavior in this case, but in this other cases, oh, well, they're not. I mean, it's like life. Like not everybody's like always in the middle. People make
Right.
choices to go one way or the other.
I'm trying to write realistic fiction, and to do that, you can't have cardboard cutouts of people who are so good or so bad. They have to be like people we know and aspects of ourselves. And I think, for better or worse, almost all my characters have aspects of me in them, because although a lot of them are based on friends or acquaintances or acquaintances or friends who stimulate the character, and so maybe I take from my friend a certain way they talk or move or whatever, but it's all really complex. All the characters are complex because it's made up of so much of, I draw from so many different wells in my writing, as I think most writers do. There's people you met, there's family members, there's things you've read, there's movies you've seen, there's your imagination, and there's other gifts that come in from who knows where, sometimes from deep in our subconscious, our collective unconscious, where we all share these certain human emotions and reactions and takes on life.
Because a lot of times, as an artist, you kind of being able to draw from your subconscious and call to it to kind of give you that flow state, is you're actually in touch with like your subconscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, your like conscious mind is making the observations. So
Yeah.
you're making all these observations, and you're actually kind of not writing it down or keeping a diary or marking it in your head as a note.
Mm-hmm.
But also, there's this kind of in the flow state, the stuff that you're kind of calling from your dream world or subconscious, and you're able to pull it. And some people, that's the download, that's the muse, but it could be coming from there.
Yeah.
Like,
Whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I was it's going to speak to that, because I usually like to work when I'm really in the throes of writing a novel, and particularly when it's starting out. I like to write in the morning as soon as I get up and sit down, because I'm still in that world of dreams and in the unconscious world, the subconscious world, and that's where a lot of the rich stuff comes from. Because that's the stuff we all share in, right, as humans. So I like to do that, and then later on in the day, after I've had lunch and a nap, I'll go back and do get in my editor mode.
The left right brain. The
Right.
left right brain kind of thing going on. I think that happens a lot because, like, as a musician, like you go into that flow state, you just do, you're just doodling or noodling around, and you put it down. But then, like when you start to, really digest, like a hit, what parts go where?
Yeah.
Then your logic mind starts saying, well, this really needs to be here. And this, so you start rearranging things and putting emphasis here and taking emphasis away from that. That seems to be some, there are some artistic choices there, but a lot of it, like logical choices too.
Yeah. I wrote a lot of this book, The Bootlegger's Bride, the way I usually write. When I get up in the morning and start working, I want to work on what I'm interested in that day, whatever it is, wherever it belongs in the book, and whatever part of the book and which character. It's just something that I saw or heard the previous day, or something that came to me in my dreams that, oh, this is what I want to work on today. And I do that. And then later on, I start seeing where it's all going to fit together. And this particular book, I rearranged the chapters in a number of different ways and finally settled on the way it's been published. And it's not chronological. It moves around from past to
timeline changes.
Timeline changes and character changes and whatnot. And so it's not structured chronologically. It's structured more emotionally and thematically. And I think that's the way our minds work. Our minds don't work. Our imaginations don't work chronologically or on a lockstep march somewhere. They come from all over. And so I've written a book that tries to reflect that and keep the reader's interest, because there's all this revelation going on, these secrets that are being buried and then unearthed later in the book.
So it's kind of like the timeline we were talking about, those different like flashback, right? So you could be at some moment and you flash back to this other moment, or you think about this other, like the timeline changes. It can be like, it's not sequential as you're saying, it's bouncing around.
Yeah. but it only bounces around from chapter to chapter, from scene to scene, and within the scenes, it's all very logical and understandable and consumable, and but there's nothing spooky about it in that regard. But
it'll all flow together. I mean, it makes that sense. Like when you get into it, there's a path that it's not overly complex, as you said.
Yeah.
You're trying to get to the heart, right? You're trying to get to you get connections or get somebody to stay in the story. To stay in the story, it's got to be something that's like understandable or relatable, or I'm like vibing on that the frequency. Oh, I feel this character's pain. I feel their happiness. I feel something that's relatable that makes me want to like know them and stay with them.
Yeah, I think in all these characters in my book, excuse me, they're admirable people in some way. The bootlegger is quite a piece of work. He's an interesting guy, and he has a lot of good values. And his wife, the bookish, excuse me, sorry. Thank you. But she's admirable too. She's beautiful. She's really well educated, deeply read, and a very deep feeling person. And their son is the same way. And his godfather, Bogdan, who was a minor character in early drafts, becomes a very critical, pivotal character. And he's a man of the streets and a gambler. And he is one of my favorite characters because he is morally a little iffy, but he's good-hearted. And so I always try to have characters that people can admire in some way.
So this book, have you approached it as an audiobook as well, or what are your thoughts about doing that?
Oh, I think it'd be great. I haven't had that suggested to me yet, but it was just published earlier this month, July 1st. We're still in July, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just been out a few weeks. I think we'll see how things go. I would certainly like to do that, and I need somebody with a good voice like you to read it.
Right. This thing is that what I found with the authors I've been talking to, because like we live in this multimedia world, there's so many people that consume books as audiobooks rather than reading a physical book or even on an iPad or something. Yeah. So because people are doing, they're on a plane, they're in the car, they like to have that audio on their headphone, and they, not just the music they listen to, they're actually listening to books. Yeah. And there's a whole audience that's discovering literature in that way. Now, I'm a child of the 70s. I don't really use audiobooks myself, but I've seen there's a trend with a lot of the authors I talk to that they get excited about that aspect of their work, and they can even like direct, that part of it, like almost like a film or a play.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to do. I would enjoy reading my own book out loud. If I had the chance. But as far as audiobooks, I have friends who use them when they're driving on long trips, and I just would be afraid to do that. I would get too engaged in the.
Yeah, I couldn't do it driving. I could be in a plane. Yeah. I could be like in an Uber going to the airport.
No, I'd be afraid to read myself into a ditch.
Yeah. I don't think I could drive doing it, but other things, before I go to bed at night, instead of watching TV, listen to a book.
Yeah, but and this may be a sacrilege for a working writer, but I read most stuff on Kindle these days. And I was always entranced as a writer with the relationship to the paper, the ink on paper. And I was in the newspaper business when I started out as a writer. And so there's always this thing about ink on paper that's been fascinating. But I like to have the book in my hands, but also, for me, I like to be able to adjust the type to the type size I want, and I like to be able to read without holding anything in my hands. Just put it on the easel and read it while I'm, having lunch or something. So
yeah, it's very convenient. The modern tech has allowed us to be able to, get all the books in one device. Like anytime I don't got to go to the library, I don't have to go to the store. I can just download and get it right now. So it's the immediacy of being able to get like your book. Somebody's like, "Oh, I want to get into it." They can just go on the Kindle right now and get it.
Yeah, yeah. When I travel, I'm glad I just take the Kindle. I don't have to, if I'm going away someplace and going off to Mexico for 5 or 6 months like I used to. I can't take a library with me unless I have my Kindle. I got the whole library there.
You got the whole thing. You like that's just the convenience of our tech today to be
Yeah,
able to do that. But then the other idea is, well, if it could be an audiobook, could it be a screenplay? Could it be a teleplay? Could it be a movie?
yeah.
Have you thought about or taking it like any of the books you've written and doing that, or is that something that's really
Well,
difficult to do?
I've been waiting for some years for Hollywood to come calling and with with some passive income for me, but that hasn't occurred. But I'd be glad to partake in that if that
It
were.
sounds like the type of thing I could see, it's got the themes that seem to be something that would be familiar, right? But your take on it is unique because that's your spin as a writer.
Yeah,
It seems like it's in an area that it would be marketable to the
but
people that are into that type of story.
yeah, there's a lot of good visual stuff too. The settings are very, very visual. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of good dialogue and people having having good contested discussions about things. And there's a love story too, as well as that. So all of it, I think, is very consumable in whatever medium it might be presented.
Yeah, because it's a summer read, as you've indicated, like in your write up, but also it's got relevance to like issues about people being wary of war, and then historical. This the historical fiction is this interesting place to be because like we got all this fantasy stuff I talk about. People like to
Right.
build these fantasy worlds, but having a step in reality that you can go to a period of time like Prohibition or Vietnam War or World War II era, and kind of like, oh, I'm going to be brought into that world, and it's the same world to me we're building that you do in a fantasy world. So I have a more relatable like signpost. It's like, oh, I'm familiar with, I understand that.
And one of the pleasures in writing this particular book for me was I got to go back and visit that world with my parents because a lot of it was from stories that they told me about Prohibition days and and the Great Depression and World War II. So it was like I got to go back and spend some time in the stuff that was over before I was born,
Mm-hmm.
and to try to imagine what it was like for them and to visit that myself. So it was a pleasure to get up every morning and work on that and be transported to some place that I was really interested in seeing.
Is writing for you like your art very cathartic? Do you like to go through things that kind of deal with emotional issues or things that you wanted to like experience again, like your childhood, your grandparents, your parents, people in your family? Does that help you process things as a writer?
I don't know if I'm looking to do that particularly. And the stories come from places that I never had envisioned. For example, my previous novel, Fail, which is a murder mystery, but it's also set on this background of the failure of St. Louis public schools and the educational malpractice and the corruption there in the government. And it came about when I was teaching remedial grammar to junior college students in inner city St. Louis. And I told a friend about this, about I had all these really ambitious young students, and none of them had been taught to read or write very well and had a high school diploma. And he said, "Do you ever think about writing a book about that?" I said, "You're kidding. You know, it was just one class I taught." And the next thing I know, I couldn't get out of my mind. These students were so earnest that they had been screwed their whole lives. So I wrote a book about it.
It seems like the ideas can come from, like you said, like the spark of an idea is not always like people want to know, well, what's the secret to writing a novel? Well, sometimes it's like if you're a creative, you're like soaking up all this stuff, and then one little trigger brings up something you didn't even know you wanted to do it, and then suddenly, like you said, you get pulled in. Like somebody said, "Why don't you write a book about that?" And you're like, yeah, they go, yeah, that actually is something. It wasn't something you planned on.
No,
You
but
kind of just
a lot of this has to do with just my worldview. And in undergraduate school, I studied sociology, and I was very interested in social stratification and all the milieu of social psychology and all that. And so I'm writing stuff that interests me in that it explores those sorts of questions. And with this current novel, with Bootlegger's Bride, it's one of my first readers, who was a academic man, said that he would say it was social realism, which was a movement in American fiction in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And so this book is sort of like writing a history for people who are unhistoried, people that no one else writes about, because it's usually about the big name gangsters, or the presidents and the powerful people and whatnot. But these are small people. These are largely working class people and people who are struggling along, immigrants, first generation Americans, rural people. And so they have struggles that are just as potent as the struggles of celebrities and important people, so-called important people.
Yeah, can we live in this kind of influence age? And I think a lot of people focus on that. Instead of like the common person. If you think about like Bruce Springsteen's always talking about like blue collar New Jersey couple.
Yeah, and I've never been that much interested in celebrity. I'm more interested in the human drama, and I don't really care who's in the New York Post front page too much.
Yeah, but I think it's more interesting to deal with that type of stuff. Just a common person.
Yeah, it's just as dramatic, maybe more dramatic, because people are making, when you're living in very dire situations and living hand to mouth, every little decision can be monumental. And in the Bootlegger's Bride, I have a scene at the Hooverville, which is the largest Hooverville of shacks on the riverfront. And during the Great Depression, there was like 5,000 people living there in just basically shacks without any water or hygiene or anything. And so their stories are interesting to me. There's people who struggled through that period.
Well, I want to be able to wrap this up now that we kind of hit the hour mark, but we do have your URL there. If people click on that, what do they find there?
They will find all my books listed. They'll find my blog, where I talk about this and that, mostly literary stuff and book stuff, and some background.
That's great. But to let people know that that's fully clickable, and they'll be able to pass through that in the description of the podcast that we have on the different platforms. We've been live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Kick. We'll be on Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify Podcast, iHeartRadio, many other channels by tomorrow.
Okay, that's great. Well, this is it's been fun doing this with you.
Thank you. Well, I hope everybody can check out The Bootlegger's Bride. It's available everywhere, right? That you can find the book, like any of the consumer
anywhere. Yeah, the books are sold, you can find it.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to make sure everybody checks that out. Go to the website that we have listed there. You'll be able to click through on it and do support the artists that we talk to, because that helps. That's why we talk to the people we talk to in this creative space. And I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.